Hi, welcome to Transmissions from the Transgender Battleground. I'm CatLady762, and as always, if you like this video, please hit the little buttons to like, subscribe, and possibly leave a comment. Today is going to be part one of a video series I'm going to do on gender identity. Specifically for this video, the concept of does no gender identity equal no transgender people? Now, one of the things I tend to pride myself on is I try to listen to and read viewpoints on both sides of the gender debate, despite the fact that I find myself agreeing more with one side than the other. And one of the people that I do keep up on is a trans rights activist that tends to post videos about things that are going on Twitter. I'm not going to name them because I don't feel like they need any further exposure, but they like to take tweets by various people, especially gender critical people, and explain why they're wrong. So apparently, something that happened relatively recently is that Lori Penny, who is ironic because that is the person whose thread on the WeSpot incident led to my being banned from Twitter. But Lori Penny apparently asked, I'm fascinated to know what sort of world gender-critical feminists would like to live in ideally. What would gender identity look like? What would be acceptable ways for, say, someone assigned male at birth who did not want to be a man? If someone felt like they didn't fit within the categories of male or female, what would be the best way for them to live their lives in the better world that gender-critical feminists imagine? That is Lori Penny's question. And a lot of gender-critical people responded, apparently. And I'm not going to read direct responses, but I will basically summarize what most of the responses that were highlighted by this trans rights activist basically said, uh, which is that in this world, there would be no gender identity, just biological sex of male and female, and that you would be allowed to live, love, and express yourself however you like while still being male or female. And I think that's a pretty accurate description of what most people who are deemed gender critical want. Now, I will admit that there are people on the extreme end that do put limitations on the idea of live however you want. Though, and those limitations tend to be, that, if you are male, you should not wear clothes that are designated for females. If you are male, it is appropriating the female body to undergo surgeries to adopt a more female-like appearance. So, I mean, I will admit that there are people that do want to place those limitations. Most people that I have interacted with and that I have experienced within this discussion do, however, really mean basically live and present yourself however you like, but also respect the fact that your biological sex is real and that there are situations in which that is the prevailing factor of how you interact with the world. So, for example, most gender critical feminists would not have a problem with the fact that I have chosen to grow out my hair, that I have altered my body to take on a more typically expected female appearance. But they would have a problem with the fact that because of these things, I felt the need or the ability to suddenly start using female spaces. Now, in this concept of this idealized world, if you are able to live and express yourself and look however you want, then presumably a part of that is the fact that there would be no negative repercussions for doing so. And I bring this up because the activist that made the original video criticized the fact that a lot of the people making comments about this idealized world still held that, there would be things such as sexual violence within an idealized world. So if you're going to make that argument, then I have to make the counter argument that there would not be violence perpetrated by people upset about a male that presents themselves in a more typically feminine manner. So therefore, as a male entering a space for males, like say a men's bathroom or locker room, there should not be, in this idealized world, a concern that I would face any repercussions for doing so. It's a space for males. I'm male. I belong there. The other thing that I found kind of funny was this concept, because it was actually stated by this activist, that gender critical people want trans people to not have access to these spaces like she has been using her entire life. Well, the thing is, I've seen pictures of this activist. I know that they did not transition as an infant. So I find it very unlikely that this particular person has been using spaces for women their entire life. They may have been using spaces for women since a certain point within their transition, but not for their entire life. But the bigger aspect of the discussion that this activist had was around gender identity and this concept that in the idealized world of gender critical people, gender identity would not exist. It seemed to cause this person great distress to want a world without gender identity. Because according to them, if you have a world without gender identity, you now have a world without trans people. Now, the prevailing ideology of the transgender community right now is that gender identity is what makes you trans. And that is all that is required to be trans is to have a gender identity that doesn't align with your birth sex. But, the issue that a lot of people have is gender identity as a concept is pretty nebulous. Supposedly, the only way we can know somebody's gender identity is to ask them, which we then have to take on faith that they are telling us the truth. And so, if all that is required to be trans is to have this gender identity, I guess I could see why the idea of not having gender identity feels like you are saying that transgender people can't exist. I'm sometimes questioned as to how I can be a gender critical trans person. Well, I happen to also not believe in this concept of a gender identity. I do believe that there are people in this world that have dysphoria. I do believe that for some people that have dysphoria, the best and most complete way to minimize that dysphoria is transition. So as somebody that had dysphoria and went through the process of transition, I am a trans person. My definition of trans requires some form of permanent transition. Social or medical, and usually probably both. But see, transition is actually something concrete. It's actually observable in most circumstances. If gender identity doesn't exist, I can still be a male that presents in a way that is more typical of females. And I can still do that 24/7. Saying that gender identity does not exist does not invalidate me, because my view of myself is not dependent on this concept. But for a lot of people, a lot of trans people, it apparently is. I also find it very ironic that the same people that shout and scream about misgendering, that shout and scream that people like Chris Chan should still be respected as trans women, despite their obvious lack of transition and their horrible behavior, that they should be respected. But if I say that I don't identify as a woman because I don't believe that woman can be an identity, and that I don't believe in gender identity, it's perfectly okay for them to turn around and call me a man. Now, to be clear, I don't care that they call me a man, except for the fact of the hypocrisy. They are much more likely to dismiss who I am and my experiences in life than the gender critical people who don't agree with trans ideology. So, does getting rid of gender identity get rid of trans people? I don't think so, because I don't think I would disappear if I suddenly, if you suddenly said, gender identity is not a thing. Okay. Fact, but on the other hand, I kind of do think that a lot of people might be able to reconcile some of the feelings that they're having if this concept of gender being this identity that can be any one of thousands of things, including anything that you personally come up with, then that's a lot of heavy thinking on a lot of people. I don't think what gender critical people are saying is by not having gender identity, trans people don't exist. What they're saying is by removing this concept, but yet allowing people to behave and act and feel how they feel without adding additional labels, it will be a better world with less people feeling dysphoric, less people feeling a need to transition, and yes, less people probably labeling themselves as transgender. Because, like it or not, a lot of dysphoria does come from the expectations attached to the labels that go along with male and female. And I'll talk about that probably more in a video talking about probably my childhood dysphoria. So the elimination of gender identity does not mean trans people are eliminated. Because the other thing is, if all it takes to be trans is this concept in your head, how could you possibly eliminate it? Now, to be fair to the activist that made the video, they went on to talk about things like restricting transition, restricting and removing the ability for people to have surgeries, which speaks to some of the ways that they view being trans, which actually, would get them in trouble with some of their fan base, because you can really only complain about the banning of medical treatment of trans people if you felt that it was required to be trans. Because if it's not a requirement to be trans, banning such treatment does nothing really to eliminate trans people. Now, you could argue that it makes it more difficult for trans people to alleviate their dysphoria, but that in itself goes against current trans narrative, that you have to have dysphoria. So, in theory, if I were to do nothing, to have transitioned, and all I said in my head to myself is, I am a woman, then I am trans. And as no one can see or hear the thought in my head, there's no way that somebody can really eliminate me for being trans. Whether you want to call that being in the closet or not, if that's all we are really saying is required, then it's not elimination. It's simply altering how we live in this world. But in this idealized world, the gender critical people are saying it wouldn't matter how you live. It's just that we're not making changes to society based on a concept of identity. So I think I will end this here. Part 2 is going to talk about the idea of does everybody have a gender identity? So stay tuned.